Hi, everyone. Sean Waldman with Secure Cyber Defense, and this is your weekly cyber update. Well, we'll hop right into the vulnerabilities, and first up is Cisco has announced a vulnerability with the Integrated Management Controller. CISA has come out with alerts for the Akira Ransomware group, and I'll touch on that just for a second. CISA is basically recommending for Akira to prioritize known exploited vulnerabilities. And the best way to do that is through the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog that CISA produces. The other thing to do is to monitor social media, because just because an alert or just because a vulnerability starts out as something that's not being exploited doesn't mean that later on it does. As a matter of fact, we're starting to see more and more that vulnerabilities start out as something, but then end up as something much worse with a higher CVSS score and something that's actually being that's being exploited. So watch those vulnerabilities carefully and monitor the known exploited vulnerability catalog, and we'll have that down in the show notes as well. Second up is enabling MFA for all services to any extent possible, especially webmail, VPN, and critical systems. There has just been a rash of vulnerabilities that are out there that are being exploited mainly because there's no MFA. Well, I mean, one, that the vulnerability exists in the first place, and two, that there's just not adequate MFA. So we've even had situations where organizations tell us, yeah, I've checked my VPN and I'm covered, only to find out that maybe some type of test account or generic account was created and doesn't have multi-factor attached to it. So make sure that you have it built into your protocols to check those things often, and make sure that you're verifying that MFA is staying, especially on VPN and webmail, and that it's not being taken off and then somebody forgets to put it back on again. And then, of course, regularly patching software to the latest version and conducting regular vulnerability assessments. We've talked about this multiple times here on this YouTube channel about how vulnerability scanning has fallen to the wayside. So please look into putting regular, almost nonstop vulnerability scanning on your network to any extent possible so that you can keep up on vulnerabilities. And where this really comes in handy is when your environment changes. So for instance, when devices make their way onto your network and maybe Windows Update wasn't run fully. So you have to run vulnerability scanning on a pretty continuous basis just to make sure that things stick. And next we'll cover some of the more prevalent cyber news headlines. MITRE announced that the organization was breached by a state-backed hacking group. In this particular case, it was back in January, and MITRE was compromised by a threat actor chaining two Ivanti VPN 0 days together. Now, the reason this is important that we talk about is because the Ivanti VPN vulnerabilities, and really, frankly, all of the Ivanti vulnerabilities, has been publicized very, very heavily. So it's important to not only be aware of vulnerabilities, especially for product that you have in your environment, but acting on that very quickly. It was also, I don't know how well it was publicized, but CISA was also compromised through a couple of those Ivanti vulnerabilities. So the only reason we bring it up, not that it was MITRE in this particular case, but really just bringing awareness that these are the Ivanti vulnerabilities, very heavily published, very high profile. Just make sure that you take action as quick as possible. Second up on the list, 22,500 Palo Alto firewalls appear to be still vulnerable and out on the internet. If you've got Palo Alto firewalls in your environment, it's very important. This particular vulnerability, number one, is noted on the known exploited vulnerability catalog entry from CISA. But I've had a couple instances where I talked to organizations about this, and they said, yeah, we're not vulnerable to this particular version, maybe because they weren't on the most recent version, which begs the question, why aren't you on the most recent version? So again, make sure that you're running vulnerability scanning inside your environment on a regular basis, and then make sure that you're acting as quickly as possible. And This is also a good opportunity to bring up the CIS controls. The Center for Internet Security has made the top 18 critical controls. And the idea behind this is that they're listed in the importance from the most important to the least important. Not that none of them are important towards the end of the list. It's just if you're going to prioritize things in your environment, the first two things that are on the list are know your hardware and know your software. If you don't know what's on your network, if you don't know what hardware you have, and you don't know what applications you have, the effectiveness of you responding to a vulnerability could be diminished greatly just because you don't know. Akira Ransomware gang has extorted 42 million and now targets Linux servers. So this is a good opportunity to just bring up in general ransomware groups. As they evolve, a lot of these bulletins come out from CISA explaining what you should do and how to protect yourself. I'll tell you, I've looked at a lot of these vulnerabilities, a lot of these alerts that come out from CISA for these threat actors, and it's very difficult to keep up with them. So you must have an infrastructure that is able to freely and almost automatically respond to these types of alerts, be able to strip out indicators of compromise like IP addresses, domains, and file hashes, and then immediately threat hunt in your environment for those IOCs. These threat actors change very, very often. Their tactics change very often. They split up. If they get hit by law enforcement, they'll split and reform as something different. So it's very important that you keep up on these, even though I know it's very difficult to do, and be able to respond to them in a very timely manner. Frontier has advised that they have shut down portions of their network after responding to a ransomware event. I bring this one up just to be advised that we're seeing a lot of carrier-based outages that very likely could take down large portions of phone and critical infrastructure. So just be aware, if you use Frontier or you use Lumen or you use some of these carriers that have consolidated, that their networks and their infrastructure are getting quite large. So just be prepared in the event of an outage to look through your business continuity and your disaster recovery protocols to make sure you're prepared if something like this was to impact you. And the last thing I wanted to cover, which is kind of the highlight, is last week there was a large 5-state outage of the 911 infrastructure for 5 states. And it was really unprecedented, and it took a lot of people by surprise. Number one, the internet lights up with absolute panic, with people wondering, is it a cyber attack? What could have possibly taken down that many 911 centers in those large states? And what happened was, according to Lumen, was that there was a fiber cut somewhere, and it was due to a light pole being installed. Now, I bring this up just to have a discussion with you all to, number one, say that our critical infrastructure and specifically our 911 system is vulnerable. So there's the older design of the 911 system, which is based on like about 1960s technology, uses something called camera trunks, and it's archaic. It has some resiliency built into it. It's not as susceptible to cyber attacks. But then you have the next generation 911 system, or next gen 911. And there's a huge responsibility for 911 systems, and in this case, PSAPs. So these are public service answering points. PSAPs are 911 centers, and even we've seen in the US, we've seen 911 centers consolidate into regional 911 centers. And as these centers move towards next gen technology, it's going to get complicated, because in the older technology, in the 1960s stuff, firewalls really aren't a thing, because this is using basically telco, telecommunications, telco infrastructure, and they're really closed systems. So once you start introducing next-gen technology or next-gen 911, that is IP-based, meaning that specifically like here in Ohio, there's a lot of responsibility on those 911 systems in order to provide those firewalls to protect their 911 systems from attack. Two of the most vulnerable, if you're wondering how would a 911 center be attacked, there's really two ways. One is by knowing the phone number that is the entry point to the 911 center. So 911 centers really are just call centers in structure. And there's a main number that is the entry number that starts the process of ringing the different call takers. And all of the 911 centers have different numbers for that entry point. And then they also have limitations on the number of 911 calls that they can take simultaneously. Inside the US, usually there's landline 911 numbers, and then there's wireless 911. Obviously, those landline numbers are used less and less, and we've had to beef up, some of those wireless numbers because really most people call 911 on their cell phone nowadays versus calling on their actual landline phone, which most people don't have anymore. The second way is through a DDoS attack, which is a distributed denial of service attack. The DDoS attack can be launched against that phone number and now into some of that infrastructure. So these 911 centers are going to end up having firewalls, which means they're going to have IP addresses, and there's a lot of things to work out from a security perspective to ensure the safety of a 911 center, to make sure that it's architected correctly and that it can defend itself from a compromise. We're hoping later on this summer, you'll see some special episodes being filmed, mainly to cover things like vacations and that type of thing. So I'm really hoping to go into detail from time to time on some of these topics. 911 is something that I'm intimately familiar with because before I started Secure Cyber Defense, I was actually in law enforcement, and part of my job for about 5.5 years was to manage a very large 911 center here in the region. And so I have a lot of knowledge about how that works. So my goal is to bring special guests and maybe even go on site to some of these facilities and bring you some in-depth information on how these things work. Well, that's all we have for today. I appreciate your time, and we'll see you next weekend.